Welcome to Real Talk Horror Edition. I'm your host, Josh Bell, and today I am here to guide you through the shadows of horror cinema. We're talking everything creepy, gruesome, and unsettling, from the films that haunt your nightmares to the cult classics that make you squirm with delight. Today, we're diving into a cornerstone of horror that's as much infamous as it is influential. If you're tuning in for the first time, here's the deal. On Real Talk Horror Edition, we dissect horror films of all kinds, exploring what makes them stick in our minds and get under our skin. Every episode, we try to go beyond the scares. We unpack the plot, the characters, the themes, the visuals, and dive deep into each film's place within the horror genre. Whether it's a defining classic, a hidden gem, or a truly wild ride, from acting to atmosphere, each piece matters in crafting these chilling tales. Today, we're going to go back in time to 1963 to talk about Blood Feast, directed by Herschell Gordon Lewis. This film is often hailed as the first true splatter picture, setting the stage for decades of gore-filled cinema to come. Blood Feast didn't just cross lines, it obliterated them, embracing blood and guts in a way that horror fans had never seen before. While its budget was small and its production quality low, it made a lasting impact, showing just how effective, if shocking, gore can be. But what makes Blood Feast stand the test of time? Is it a gruesome masterpiece, a guilty pleasure, or a campy horror relic? We'll break it all down in this episode, so grab a snack. Maybe not spaghetti for this one. Turn the lights down and let's dig into one of horror's most gruesome groundbreakers, Blood Feast. Blood Feast was directed by the Godfather of Gore himself, Herschell Gordon Lewis. Blood Feast is a film that, as I said, is as infamous as it is groundbreaking. Released back in 1963, Blood Feast follows Fuad Ramses, a deranged Egyptian caterer operating in Miami who is obsessed with the ancient goddess Ishtar. Ramses embarks on a ritualistic killing spree, gruesomely murdering young women and harvesting their body parts to create a sacrificial feast in honor of Ishtar. His ultimate goal? Well, that's to revive the goddess through this horrific banquet, which he plans to serve at a party for his wealthy client, Mrs. Dorothy Fremont. What Blood Feast lacks in narrative finesse is more than compensates for its sheer shock value. With its ritualistic undertones and graphic violence, the film takes us into a bizarre world where horror is tied to ancient mysticism and blurs the lines between camp and exploitation. For many horror fans, Blood Feast represents the beginning of the splatter subgenre, a category of horror that uses the excessive gore and graphic violence as a form of visual storytelling. Though created on a shoestring budget, Lewis's pioneering vision for Blood Feast was clear. Shock the audience like never before. The result is a film that broke new ground in horror by unapologetically focusing on graphic violence, opening the door for countless filmmakers to explore in its most visceral, grotesque forms. The plot of Blood Feast is, to put it simply, skeletal. If you're hoping for a rich storyline or layered character development, this isn't the place to find it. The narrative exists as a thin scaffolding upon which Herschell Gordon Lewis drapes his infamous gore sequences. Fuad Ramses' motivations for his killing spree are touched upon briefly, an obsession with resurrecting the goddess Ishtar. But beyond that, we're given little insight into his character. The victims and other supporting characters, including the police, serve as placeholders to move the carnage along, rather than as developed personalities. And yet this bare-bones style of storytelling is oddly effective. By stripping away subplots, twists, or even meaningful dialogue, Blood Feast becomes this streamlined vehicle for shock. It moves at a brisk pace and never pretends to be anything more than what it is, a showcase for grotesque horror. This minimalism, though a weakness by today's storytelling standards, becomes a strength here because it lets the focus stay on what Lewis intended, and that's the shock and the awe. Rather than suspense and subtlety, the film's unembellished narrative has a certain bluntness that actually heightens the impact of these gory set pieces, keeping us squarely in the realm of pure exploitative horror. But what truly distinguishes Blood Feast in horror history is its unapologetic, boundary-pushing focus on the gore. Unlike anything mainstream audiences had seen at the time, in an era where horror relied heavily on suggestion, shadows, and off-screen violence, Lewis took this dramatically different route. He showed every gruesome detail and in full color. He didn't shy away from the extreme close-ups of blood and guts and body parts. He reveled in the shock and the revulsion it elicited. This approach effectively launched the splatter genre, marking Blood Feast as the first film to focus almost exclusively on explicit gore as the main attraction. By deliberately showing this carnage, Lewis shifted the horror landscape, moving away from this psychological terror and suspense towards visceral, grotesque horror that confronts us with the reality of violence. This focus on gore, rather than suspense or supernatural elements, created a new subgenre. It opened the door for films, now albeit these have better stories, but films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, and much later Saw and Hostel. Though Blood Feast may lack polish, it earns its place as a cult classic for its influence and boldness, proving that horror could be visceral in more than one way. When it comes to performances, Blood Feast is an exercise in camp at its most unrestrained. Mal Arnold's portrayal of Fuad Ramses is gloriously exaggerated. Wide-eyed stares and his voice that drips with this theatrical menace. Rather than being chilling, Arnold's performance leads into the absurd. It makes Ramses less a terrifying killer and more a caricature or cartoon version of a villain. His dramatic gestures, his awkward sneers, and gleeful expressions as he commits his atrocities make for some unintentional hilarity, these moments that lend the film its cult charm. It's this over-the-top style, while far from traditionally good acting, it brings a memorable flair to the character. It's as if Arnold knew he wasn't crafting this nuanced performance and leaned fully into campy vibes, which gives Blood Feast an oddball energy and makes it strangely captivating. Connie Mason as Suzette Fremont, the main target of Ramses' murderous plans, delivers this stiff, robotic performance. Her line delivery is flat, it's detached. It makes her appear more like an on-screen prop than another living character. And yet, in this bizarre universe, this wooden acting adds to the overall tone. It creates this surreal viewing experience where the stakes feel dreamlike and distant, as if we're watching someone's surreal nightmare unfolding rather than a genuine horror story. Mason's awkward performance fits perfectly with the film's low-budget aesthetic, and it gives us these moments of unintentional comedy, reinforcing the cult status that Blood Feast has come to embody. In terms of character depth, Blood Feast offers nothing here. Ramses is painted with the broadest of villainous strokes, driven by his devotion to Ishtar and that desire to bring her back through sacrificial gore. Beyond this single-minded obsession, there's no exploration of Ramses' past, his motivations, or even his personality. Similarly, the other characters, including Suzette, her mother, and the bumbling detectives, they serve primarily as set pieces in Ramses' ritualistic spree rather than as dynamic figures. Strangely enough, though, this lack of character development works in the film's favor. These flat characters, they contribute to that strange, surreal tone of the movie. And if you're watching a horror-filled or horror-themed fever dream rather than a traditionally structured narrative, those are the characters you would see, so it works. This disconnect from realism, where these characters lack agency or depth, it gives this film an unsettling quality that heightens the absurdity of Ramses' grotesque acts. In Blood Feast, the characters, they're not meant to evolve or grow. They're symbolic placeholders, each one another stepping stone for Ramses' ritualistic bloodbath. This approach aligns with the film's purpose, which was to shock and disturb, not to engage us in any emotionally driven storyline. This is horror stripped to its most basic function. It's a showcase of carnage, populated by faces we're unlikely to remember in the end. Although Blood Feast is unapologetically gory and straightforward, beneath the blood-soaked surface lies a subtle commentary on blind devotion and obsession. Ramses is consumed by his fanatical dedication to this goddess Ishtar, to the point where he disregards all moral and social boundaries in his twisted pursuit. This blind loyalty becomes Ramses' driving force, replacing any personal identity or humanity he might have once had. In his eyes, the murder and mutilation are justified because they serve a higher purpose, albeit it's a darkly distorted one. Though Ramses, through him, the film hints at these dangers of fanatical devotion, how an obsession with a single ideal, belief, or figure can lead a person down a path of moral and ethical erosion. In a sense, Ramses' journey mirrors the theme of losing yourself to a destructive purpose, and it shows us how unchecked devotion, devoid of rationality or conscience, can really lead to monstrosity. Now, it's not overly stated, but this theme adds a peculiar philosophical layer to Blood Feast and suggests that the horror doesn't just stem from the gore on screen, but from the terrifying notion of a mind consumed entirely by dark and sinister purposes. Symbolically, though, Blood Feast uses Ramses' ritualistic sacrifices as a clash between ancient mysticism and the modern commercialized world. Ramses' obsession with Ishtar represents old world practices and dark mysticism, intruding upon this suburban 1960s life, an era that was marked by optimism and conventional values. Miami, with its sunny beaches, its tourist appeal, it serves as a stark backdrop to the sinister quest of Ramses to resurrect this foreign, ancient goddess through blood sacrifice. This cultural and temporal clash might reflect a subtle fear of the unfamiliar, a reminder of the unease some Americans felt towards the foreign influences and exotic ideas that were coming about during the 1960s. The character of Ishtar, an ancient Mesopotamian deity, symbolizes the allure and danger of forgotten traditions and otherworldly powers. Ramses brings this ancient belief system into an unsuspecting modern world, forcing it to confront something that's both alien and grotesque. This fear of the unknown, of ancient foreign practices creeping in to a world that considers itself advanced, adds a layer of social commentary. Now, Blood Feast horror isn't just about shocking visuals. It's also an uncomfortable reminder that our modern comforts can be easily disrupted by something dark and ancient, or something lurking just below the surface. In this way, Blood Feast embodies this primitive fear of the other, where Ramses' exotic practices are presented as a threat to the familiar. The film subtly explores the horror of cultural collision, and it reminds us that our darkest fears often lie in these spaces between what's known and the unknown. The cinematography in Blood Feast is far from polished, with a raw, almost amateurish quality that may not have been entirely unintentional. It ends up enhancing the film's unsettling tone. Lewis keeps the shots very simple and static, He often lingers on the gore rather than cutting away. There's little in the way of dramatic angles, there's no complex lighting, which might to today's viewers sound like a flaw, but the blunt approach actually gives Blood Feast a disturbing voyeuristic quality. The lack of stylization creates this stark, almost clinical view of the violence, lending the film this uncomfortable realism that's even more evocative of low-budget crime documentary than typical horror movie. By keeping the camera work straightforward like this, Lewis invites us into the horror rather than insulating us with visual tricks. It makes each scene feel unpolished but disturbingly close to the reality. What truly stands out here, though, visually, is this unabashed gore. Blood Feast doesn't hold back. We're shown severed limbs, there's organs on display, bright, excessive splashes of blood and unflinching close-up shots. Herschell Gordon Lewis intentionally made the blood a vibrant, cartoonish red, knowing that this exaggerated color would both stand out against the dull, gritty backdrop and prevent it from blending into the grainy, low-quality film stock. This deliberate choice makes the blood look way more vivid than natural, turning it into this gruesome spectacle that feels unsettling, and it's strangely captivating. And for audiences in the 1960s who had never seen this level of graphic detail, these effects were horrifyingly novel. Today, while the practical effects might appear exaggerated or unrealistic, they maintain a kind of visceral charm that shows just how groundbreaking Lewis's vision was in pushing those boundaries of on-screen horror. And the film's minimal set design and use of Miami's everyday locations further contribute to this eerie realism. Unlike the haunted houses and shadowy forests of many previous horror films, Blood Feast unfolds in a mundane setting. In suburban kitchens, a quiet street, a sparse apartment, it makes the horror feel uncomfortably close to home. This ordinary spaces, they contrast heavily with the grotesque acts taking place within them. It's this surreal combination of the mundane and the horrific that makes the film visually unforgettable. In many ways, Blood Feast set the stage for the modern splatter film, where shocking gore often becomes the focal point. Lewis' willingness to show the horror in such graphic and unapologetic terms was revolutionary, and marking the film as a visual template for generations of horror filmmakers willing to embrace the grotesque as an art form. The sound design in Blood Feast may be primitive, but again, this rawness contributes to the film's unsettling vibe. The effects are blunt, screeches, loud thuds, abrupt shifts that create a jarring, disorienting experience. There is no subtlety in how the sounds are layered or mixed. Instead, they're piled on to amplify the gore in a way that feels intentionally unrefined. The lack of finesse here works almost to the film's advantage, immersing us in that disquieting sensory assault. The rough, amateur quality of the sound effects puts us uncomfortably close to the horrors that are happening on screen, and it forces us into Ramses' world where there's no reprieve from the visceral, brutal chaos. It's the auditory equivalent of a low-budget haunted house. Clunky, but undeniably effective. The music in Blood Feast leans heavily on eerie, organ-heavy compositions that kind of remind you of a carnival or funhouse music gone wrong. Rather than creating suspense in the traditional sense, the soundtrack adds to the bizarre, almost surreal quality of the film. It's strange, the dissonant notes give the impression of a twisted vaudeville-style show, making the whole experience feel like a descent into a macabre spectacle. The off-kilter organ music, it feels at odds with the brutal imagery, creating an atmosphere that's both disturbing and slightly absurd, which really suits this film's campy and chaotic energy. This mismatched tone becomes part of the film's charm, It's as if Blood Feast knows it's not a polished horror masterpiece and really leans into that low-budget carnival aesthetic, creating an atmosphere that feels at once horrifying and almost like a parody. In a way, the odd blend of those jarring sound effects and unpolished music makes Blood Feast feel like what will eventually become in the 70s known as a midnight horror show, and it's gone rogue. It reinforces its cult appeal. The soundscape isn't meant to be sophisticated. It's meant to be blunt and eerie and relentlessly loud, placing us in this unsettling limbo where horror and absurdity are colliding. One thing Blood Feast does not waste time on is subtlety or prolonged buildup. Clocking in at just over an hour, it has this relentless pace that pushes forward like a fever dream. It refuses to slow down or give us any real moments of relief. The breakneck speed also serves the film well. It masks some of those weaknesses by never lingering too long on any one scene or detail. There's no room for filler. Instead, Blood Feast dives headlong into the bizarre storytelling and keeps the gruesome scenes coming one right after the other. The fast pacing builds a strange kind of momentum. It pulls us deeper into this madness and never lets us catch our breath. While other horror films of that time would have drawn out the suspense, Blood Feast just goes for shock over subtlety at every turn, pushing forward like a runaway train of carnage. And the editing is notoriously rough and unpolished. Abrupt, jarring cuts that give the film a jagged, fragmented feel, choppy transitions and sudden scene changes that could be viewed as amateurish but work well in the film's favor, amplifying this sense of unease. Each edit feels almost haphazard, as if it was pieced together by a blunt instrument, this rawness reinforcing the film's reputation as an unrefined, primal work of horror. It's almost as if the film itself is cut and stitched together in a way that mirrors the grotesque ritual that Ramses performs on his victims. Adding to the chaotic, disorienting experience for the viewer, these rough edits also keep us off balance. Instead of easing into each new scene, we're jolted abruptly from one moment to the next, and it reinforces the sense that we're watching something forbidden, something we shouldn't be able to see. In a strange way, these unpolished cuts bring more authenticity to the film and make it feel like a gritty underground film, an experience far removed from the refined horror movies that were coming out at this time. It's this unfiltered, almost reckless approach to editing that contributes to the film's enduring cult appeal, capturing the raw essence of Lewis's vision as he carves out a new path for horror. In the end, the movie's pacing and editing, they work together to create that unrefined and hypnotic descent into gore. Refusing to conform to convention, no polished storytelling, Blood Feast invites us into an experience that's shocking, unhinged, and utterly unique. And the distinctive style will become a hallmark of Herschell Gordon Lewis and set the stage for future exploitation films, proving that sometimes the film's flaws are its most memorable strengths. Now, Blood Feast isn't going to keep you up at night with lingering images of terror or make you second guess any creak in your house. This isn't a slow burn psychological thriller or a tension-filled haunted house story. Instead, the fear factor comes from its in-your-face violence. The film's impact lies not in its ability to frighten, but in its sheer audacity. When it was released back in '63, the gore was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. There are no subtle creeping moments of dread, just a shocking barrage of blood, limbs, and carnage. It is not a terrifying film in the sense of traditional horror. Blood Feast breaks new ground by boldly confronting us with the graphic violence, and that in itself was a revolution. For its time, the horror wasn't about creating a foreboding atmosphere. It wasn't about delivering suspenseful buildup. Instead, it's laying a foundation for a new kind of terror, one that would be defined by visceral, immediate reactions rather than slow, creeping dread found in more atmospheric horror. The film's gore was so over the top, so out of bounds for the time, that its very existence was kind of terrifying. It made audiences uncomfortable by pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable to show on screen. So it's never going to introduce the type of fear that leaves you looking over your shoulder, but it's a unique kind of fright, an experience that kind of leaves you shocked, maybe disgusted, and perhaps a little awestruck by the audacity of its horror. Blood Feast is unambiguously a gore-driven film. There's nothing else quite like it in terms of its commitment to the grotesque. This isn't a film that builds tension or relies on slowly unfolding mystery. This is an early and aggressive example of splatter. Violence takes center stage, it overshadows everything else. The plot, the acting, the characters are all secondary to the carnage. That's what makes Blood Feast so significant in the evolution of horror. At a time when films were tiptoeing around showing explicit violence, this movie dove headfirst into a red pool of blood. Offered the viewers of the day a front row seat to a blood-soaked spectacle. There is no balance here. The film is entirely focused on delivering one gruesome sequence after another. There's no attempt to offer psychological depth, no atmospheric tension, no character building. For some horror fans, especially those who enjoy the over-the-top nature of exploitation films, this is a dream come true. A relentless and unapologetic showcase of blood and guts. If you love horror movies, unfiltered, full of raw, unrestrained violence, this is a must-see. However, if you're the kind of viewer who prefers a mix of psychological tension with your horror, then Blood Feast might feel one note or even repetitive. But at least it's just over an hour, so you can handle it. Its commitment to gore comes at the expense of all other elements. So much so that it can become monotonous for some. But this focus on brutality is exactly what made the film so influential. It has defined a new era of horror where shock value, visual spectacle could take the lead over atmosphere, character development, storytelling, anything else. Ultimately, Blood Feast isn't here to creep you out with quiet dread. No slow build of suspense or unease. This is here to make you never forget what you're seeing, with a non-stop parade of macabre visuals that would pave the way for many more gore-centric films to follow. This is a blood-soaked tribute to shock value and unrestrained horror, and for fans of that genre, this is the classic. So, when you look at Blood Feast through the lens of traditional filmmaking, it is rough around the edges. The acting is not, I would say, often laughable. It's always laughable. The performances are leaning way more into the realm of camp than anything remotely sinister. The plot is thin. It doesn't really hold up under scrutiny, and the pacing can sometimes feel disjointed. If we are evaluating the film based on standard filmmaking criteria, it's safe to say its score would be a 3 out of 10. It's awkward, it's amateurish, its technical shortcomings are evident in every single frame. Yet, this very clunkiness is part of its charm. It's what gives Blood Feast its status as a landmark in horror history. So if we shift gears and we evaluate it on an influence scale, Blood Feast earns a much higher score. This is a 9 out of 10. It is no exaggeration to say that no one had ever done anything like this before. It pushed the boundaries the way that no one had even dared try. It invented a whole new genre, At a time when horror films were still largely focused on psychological terror and suspense, Blood Feast blazed a trail for brutal, blood-soaked spectacles that would eventually dominate the horror scene. This was a film that threw caution to the wind and said, "This is what horror can be: raw, graphic, and unapologetically grotesque." Its legacy lives on in modern horror and influences everything from the splatter films of the 80s to the contemporary wave of more extreme horror films like Terrifier. So in that sense, Blood Feast is a curious, albeit gruesome piece of horror history. It is not a traditionally good movie. It is a vital one, if only for the ways it shaped the horror genre. For those interested in how horror evolved, this film is an essential watch. It's a shocking, pioneering experiment in gore that has to be seen to be believed. But be warned, this is not a movie for the faint of heart. For hardcore fans and anyone interested in the roots of the genre, especially the evolution of gore cinema, Blood Feast is a must-watch. It does not have the technical polish of modern films, but its place in horror history is undeniable. For fans of modern gore fest, this is the film that started it all. And that's something that simply cannot be overlooked. However, if you are someone who prefers your horror to be sophisticated, atmospheric, or subtle, it's best to go ahead and skip this one. Blood Feast is a low-budget, no-holds-barred ride through unrestrained violence. It's definitely not for someone who's squeamish or faint-hearted. If you can stomach grotesque visuals and clunky storytelling, though, this film offers a glimpse into the early days of horror's most shocking subgenre. This is a film that went on to define an era of horror cinema, and for that alone, it's earned its place in the history books. Now that we've dissected Blood Feast, it's your turn. What did you think of the film? Did it shock you as much as it shocked audiences back in the 60s? Or if you've seen it before, how does it hold up for you? Whether you found yourself cringing, laughing, or genuinely horrified by its groundbreaking gore, we want to hear from you. Drop us a line with your thoughts and share your takes on this classic gore fest. Did it live up to its legendary status? Or was it more of a grisly curiosity? Hit us up on social media. We're on Threads and Instagram and Slasher at RealRealTalk. You can send us an email at therealrealtalk@gmail.com. We would love to hear your reactions. But don't go too far, because next time we're going to make a dramatic shift. After all the shocking bloodshed here, we're going to take a detour from pure gore into something a little more campy, but just as iconic. Get ready for the madcap mayhem of Reanimator. With a crazed scientist, reanimated corpses, and a wild blend of horror and comedy, it is one ride you're not going to want to miss. Get ready for undead chaos, dark humor, and a horror experience that's just as laugh out loud as it is grotesque. It's going to be a blast, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Real Real Talk, the horror edition. We hope you had as much fun going through Blood Feast as I did writing it, watching it, and reliving it. If you're enjoying the show, please don't forget, subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Your feedback means the world and helps us continue to bring the best in horror cinema commentary. Again, for all the latest updates, behind the scenes peeks, horror discussions, follow us Instagram, Threads, Slasher at RealRealTalk. And remember, if you ever need someone to keep you company through your late night horror binge, we've got your back. Until next time, stay creepy. And as always look behind you. You never know what's lurking in the shadows.